The Rockingham government, which had helped repeal the Stamp Act, was suffering at the hands of their Tory opponents, who criticized them harshly and felt that they had been played by the American colonists. Charles Townshend, who served as the Chancellor of the Exchequer to the ministry of William Pitt, the Elder, found himself in control of the administration. When Pitt suddenly passed away in 1766, Townshend himself died a year later. But before he did, urged by the financial crisis and the insistence of the Tory factions within, Parliament passed a series of 5 acts which would collectively bear his name. The Townshend Acts. The first act, known as the Revenue Act, imposed direct taxation on lead, glass, paper, paint, and notably tea. The second created a new customs board for the North American colonies in Boston and allowed customs officials unprecedented control over vessels coming in and out of colonial ports. The third suspended the New York Assembly from conducting business until it had complied with the requirements of the Quartering Act, passed in 1765 alongside the Stamp Act. The fourth act, known as the Indemnity Act, colloquially known as the Tea Act, lowered the commercial duties on tea imported by the East India Company, hoping to combat the smuggling of Dutch East India tea into English ports. The final act, known as the Colonial Trade Act, passed after Townshend's death in 1767, also aimed to target smuggling and granted admiralty courts jurisdiction over all matters concerning customs violations, taking away the authority of local colonial courts. Before his death, Townshend feared that it would provoke a rebellious response from the American colonists. Townshend could not have been more correct. A flurry of activity gripped the American colonies. Pamphlets and letters flew from the pens of lawyers and farmers alike as they published their grievances in papers and broadsides across the colonies. Committees of correspondence were formed and shared ideas and debated the political and economic situation in the colonies. Once again, the Sons of Liberty were active, implementing the boycott of British goods and inciting riots where the opportunity was ripe. Particularly in Boston, unrest began to ferment in such a way that the customs officials were obliged to leave town. This prompted British authorities to send for British troops to occupy Boston to quell the mob. On March 5, 1770, the consequences became quite clear when a young British sentry guarding the Boston Customs House was set upon by an angry mob of colonists. Accounts of the event state that the incident began as an argument between the private and a young wigmaker's apprentice, who, upon insulting the private and his officer, was warned away from the post, refusing to go and further insulting the officer. He was struck in the head by the private's musket. A crowd began to gather as the altercation grew louder, and then bells rang out, indicating a fire, drawing yet more Bostonians toward the lone sentry. The sentry sent a runner to get help. As the crowd became more violent, throwing ice and oyster shells at the sentry and calling for him to fire his weapon. Captain Thomas Preston and a handful of men from the Grenadier Company of the 29th Regiment of Foot arrived at the scene and deployed around the sentry. With bayonets fixed the crowd, now grown to 300 or 400 by some estimates, pressed in around the British troops, still throwing objects and shouting for them to fire. Preston shouted for the crowd to disperse and ordered his men to load their muskets. As the crowd pressed in on Preston and his men, they shouted, "Fire! Damn you, fire!" A young private was struck in the head by a flying object, causing him to drop his musket. He bent to retrieve it and stood up and unintentionally fired into the crowd without orders. In a panic, the rest of the soldiers fired into the crowd in a ragged volley. As the crowd broke in horror and the smoke cleared, it revealed 3 dead colonists: Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks, a mixed-race former slave. Samuel Maverick and Patrick Carr were wounded and would die shortly after 5 colonists had been killed in what would be known as the Boston Massacre. The city was put on high alert, and British troops mustered in full force, preparing to defend against further riots. The trial which followed was a media circus, as the Sons of Liberty latched onto those who had died as patriots and martyrs. Attorney John Adams defended the British soldiers, despite his own personal feelings toward the British abuse of the American colonies and his relationship to his cousin, Samuel Adams, who was one of the founding members of the Sons of Liberty. Adams, whose devout loyalty to the law led him to believe that all men were entitled to a trial, no matter who they were or what they had done, successfully argued the men were not guilty of murder and had 6 of these soldiers acquitted and 2 others found guilty only of manslaughter. Adams' experience in the aftermath of the trial did little to move him closer to his cousin's patriot leanings, but did affirm his belief in the legitimacy of a government of laws. Tensions remained high in Boston, but gradually began to recede elsewhere. In 1773, amidst one of the worst banking crises of the 18th century, the British Parliament again made an attempt to ensure the survival of the British East India Company by undercutting the illegal importation of Dutch tea to the American colonies, while lowering the cost of EIC tea to the lowest possible amount. Known as the Tea Act of 1773, the act allowed the EIC to unload its cargo in the American colonies without paying any duties on it, while charging an exorbitant amount on Dutch tea. The act prompted the Sons of Liberty to organize a raid on Wade. Prompted the Sons of Liberty. 3 merchant ships docked in Boston Harbor carrying loads of East India Company tea, which had yet to be offloaded. Known as the Boston Tea Party, the Sons of Liberty boarded the ships and dumped 342 crates of tea into the harbor. The loss of tea amounted to approximately 9,659 pounds. In 1773, the equivalent of 1.7 million US dollars. Today, Parliament was outraged and responded by passing a series of acts, known as the Intolerable Acts, in 1774. The first three acts, the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Administration of Justice Act, all targeted Massachusetts alone and punished the city of Boston and the Massachusetts Bay Colony for its role in the Tea Party. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until the colonists paid for the destroyed tea. The act angered citizens in Boston who had not even participated in the Tea Party, and they felt they were being punished unjustly without being able to testify in their own defense. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked Massachusetts' charter and brought the colony under direct British control. Town meetings were limited, and all appointments had to be appointed by the royal governor. The Administration of Justice Act allowed the royal governor of Massachusetts to order the trial or retrial of any royal official to take place in Great Britain if the accused could not get a fair trial in Massachusetts. The final act, which affected all of the colonies, was the Quartering Act of 1774, which allowed royal governors to house soldiers in buildings if suitable quarters were not provided by the colonies. These acts were the last straw for many colonists. The perceived violation of what they viewed as their natural and constitutional rights as British subjects threatened to turn resentment of their British mother country to hatred and send the colonists into rebellion. Parliament hoped that the Intolerable Acts would isolate the problem, which seemed to be the strongest in Massachusetts. Meanwhile, the colonists began taking steps beyond simple committees of correspondence. The formation of the First Continental Congress in the fall of 1774 worked to redress the Intolerable Acts and petition the British government for a repeal, as they had in 1765 with the Stamp Act. The petition to the king never received a formal reply. With no reply from the British government, in May 1775, the colonies convened again. The Second Continental Congress found itself again attempting to organize a general boycott of British goods and achieve some kind of formal response from the Parliament, when the tension, which had gripped the American colonies since the end of the French and Indian War, finally reached a breaking point in a small village outside of Boston. On a mild mid-April morning in 1775, on the evening of April 18, 1775, with tensions running high between the people of Boston and the British troops garrisoned in and around the city, the Sons of Liberty discovered that General Thomas Gage planned to march British troops to a cache of weapons and powder hidden in Concord, just a few miles from Boston, and destroy the supply. Patriots Paul Revere and William Dawes rode through that the regulars are turning out, or as it's more popularly remembered, The British are coming. Colonial militiamen rose from their slumber, gathered their muskets, and rushed to stop the British troops from making it to Concord. On the morning of April 19, 1775, Massachusetts militiamen faced off against British regulars on the Lexington town green. When ordered to lay down their arms and return to their homes, the militia refused and stood their ground. Captain John Parker, commanding the group of 70 or so Massachusetts militia, ordered them not to fire unless fired upon first. British officers ordered their men to level their muskets, but cautioned them not to fire. Suddenly a shot rang out. No one knows where the shot came from. Neither side laid claim, both blaming the other. With this moment, known as the shot heard around the world, the resentment and anger boiled over at last. And the war began when the American Revolution began. It did not start as a revolution. While certainly the ideas it generated were revolutionary, the actions of the First Continental Congress were those of a legislative body, hoping to attain a form of reconciliation with the mother country, better characterized as a rebellion. The earliest stages of the war were fought by the colonists to reclaim what they saw as their natural-born rights as British subjects and citizens. On the home front, early victories for the militia kept the spark of rebellion lit. However, it was not long before the British put a concerted effort into putting down the uprising. At the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775, British troops stormed earthworks held by the colonial militia near Boston. In a costly victory, it was becoming clear to many that if the colonies did not unify, they would be crushed one by one. While some representatives in the Continental Congress, now in its second session, still erred on the side of caution, believing that a reconciliation decision to form a single, unified army to prevent their forces from being wiped out piecemeal. At the head of this new Continental Army would be a colonel from the colony of Virginia, named to George Washington. Washington, born from one of the most prominent families in colonial Virginia, had had aspirations to be a naval officer in the English Navy when he was a young man. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was wary. She knew that a life at sea was a difficult one and could lead to an early death or maiming. She implored her son not to enlist in the Navy and to pursue a career in the Army instead. Washington obeyed and would spend much of his young adult life attempting to gain a commission in the British Army. He worked as a surveyor and endeared himself to the Royal Governor of Virginia, hoping to obtain that commission. It never came. Instead, Washington served as a colonel in the Virginia militia and implemented his own particular style of leadership, modeled after the British. Serving in this capacity, a young George Washington found himself at the center of some of the most important moments of the French and Indian War. At Fort Necessity and the Battle of Monongahela, Washington served alongside British soldiers as a colonial officer, and despite surviving numerous close calls with death and leading his troops valiantly, he was never made an official offer for a commission in the British Army more than a decade after the end of the French and Indian War. Washington was serving as a representative of Virginia at the Second Continental Congress. When it came time for the Congress to decide who would lead this new united army, Washington was a natural choice. While his track record on the battlefield was less than stellar, his experience was unquestioning, and the fact that he was a Virginian pleased many of the Southern delegates of the Congress, as the war thus far had been fought by and almost entirely took place in the northern colonies. In June 1775, after receiving a unanimous vote of approval from the Congress, Washington rode north for Boston and began to construct the necessary administration for the new Continental Army. The Continental Army struggled with many issues. Supply was always a chief concern. Lack of food and a reliable supply chain meant that the army needed to constantly forage for sustenance. This meant a tense and sometimes violent relationship with the civilian populations near where the armies had camped. Command differences plagued the army as well. Beyond disgruntled and entitled officers, this army consisted of troops from nearly everyone's colony. On the East Coast, these soldiers were as different from each other as if they had come from another country. In one early instance, General Washington literally had to pull soldiers off of each other during a snowball fight outside of Boston, which had turned into an outright brawl between soldiers from Massachusetts and Virginia, uniting these men into a fighting force was a war unto itself. Through the winter of 1775 to 76, the Continental Army diverted its efforts in two directions. To the north, the Congress ordered an invasion of Quebec under the command of Generals Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery, hoping to rally the Canadians to form a 14th colony and rise against the British. As well, it did not go as planned. And while successes were made in upstate New York, the invasion ultimately ended in a dismal failure. Montgomery was killed, and the majority of Continental force was either captured or succumbed to smallpox. Meanwhile, Washington stayed with the army around Boston and managed the siege, with 11,000 British troops trapped in the city. Washington hoped the winter would force them to surrender, but he lacked the artillery to mount a full-scale siege. He sent the young colonel, Henry Knox, to acquire artillery from the recently captured fort Ticonderoga, and in March 1776, Knox returned to Boston, having successfully gotten the guns over the Berkshire Mountains through the winter, with Knox's guns looking down from Dorchester Heights. The British decided to evacuate the city. On March 17, 1776, the Continental Army reoccupied Boston, much to the joy of the civilian population. In the spring of 1776, the war was beginning to spread to other parts of the 13 colonies. Fighting had broken out in the Carolinas, and a British siege of Charleston was thwarted by a daring defense of Sullivan's Island. In upstate New York, the survivors of the Canada expedition fought to hold on to the gains they had made at Fort Ticonderoga and other key locations on Lake Champlain. Washington's forces in Boston moved south to occupy New York City. The Continental Congress ordered Washington to defend the island city. Despite the lack of a meaningful navy, Washington was uncertain his army, many of whom were untrained and undisciplined militia, was going to be capable of standing up to a British assault on the city in Philadelphia, now the American capital. The Second Continental Congress had shifted from a government body imploring the British government for a redress of grievances to a government body responsible for the management of a war. The Olive Branch Petition sent to England in July 1775 had been the last attempt of the Congress to make peace with the mother country. It had been met with the naming of the Congress as traitors and the Revolution as illegal. After the action in Boston, it had become clear to a faction of the Congress, led by John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and others, that free war status the American colonies in Great Britain had shared was no longer a possibility. The necessity for self-rule had surpassed any possible reconciliation with England. Many of the representatives also realized that victory in this conflict could only be achieved with the assistance of a foreign power, namely France. They knew France would not intervene on behalf of rebel colonists, but they might for a sovereign nation. Consequently, by early summer 1776, the majority of the provincial congresses were prepared for a complete separation. On June 11th, the Congress formed a committee to draft a document stating the justification on their separation from Britain. The Declaration of Independence was written largely by Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. It laid out in plain words the reason for the former colonies, now states, desire for separation, and affirmed the assertion that they had every right as men to make the separation. After considerable revisions to the original drafts, including the removal of a section condemning the British slave trade, the Declaration was adopted by Congress on July 2, 1776, and its final wording formally ratified on July 4, 1776. Its most prolific line read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The Declaration changed the shape of the war from a rebellion to a full-fledged revolution. The new colonies began operating as separate and autonomous states, bound loosely by their unified Congress. Washington had the declaration read to his soldiers. In New York City, spirits soared at last. The soldiers of the Continental Army felt they had something to band together for. Independence. The British struck back in August 1776, launching a series of devastating attacks in and around New York City. As Washington had feared, his army was not prepared for the professional and well-disciplined British troops. And without a navy, he had no hope of defending the island of Manhattan. After 5 consecutive defeats, Washington was forced to abandon New York City to the British and began a prolonged and bloody retreat into New Jersey and across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. In late November 1776, Lord William Howe, the commander of the British troops in North America, pursued Washington into New Jersey and established a series of garrisons which stretched from New York as far south as Mount Holly. Washington knew that if he did not act quickly, the war would be over. He devised a plan to cross the Delaware on December 25, 1776, and attack an exposed garrison in Trenton, New Jersey, occupied by a brigade of German troops hired by the British, known as Hessians. Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas night through a blinding nor'easter and marched his tired and beleaguered army south to Trenton. The Hessians were surprised by the arrival of the Continental Army, as fighting and maneuvering troops through the winter was generally viewed as difficult and dangerous. For 18th century armies, he achieved a swift victory, fighting through the streets of Trenton, and won his first battle as commander of the Continental Army. 9 days later, after a tactically brilliant running engagement on January 2nd, the Continental Army again achieved victory on the morning of January 3rd. In Princeton, New Jersey, the 3 battles fought kept the Revolution alive. In its darkest hour in 1777, the British were desperate to regain control of the situation and launched 2 separate offensives. The British LED by Sir William Howe captured the American capital of Philadelphia after defeating Washington at Brandywine, and Germantown in the fall of 1777. While the loss of the capital was a blow to the morale of the Continental Army, the army had not fallen apart as Howe had expected, and Washington took his forces to winter at Valley Forge, just a few miles west of Philadelphia. In upstate New York, British General John Burgoyne pushed his army south from Canada, capturing Fort Ticonderoga and hoping to sever New England from the rest of the United States in order to bring about a swift end to the war. Instead, Burgoyne faced off against Continental generals Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates, fighting a series of battles near Saratoga, New York. Thanks to impressive leadership by Arnold and sound strategy by Gates, Burgoyne's army was defeated and ultimately forced to surrender in October 1777. It was the largest British army to ever surrender to an enemy force. To date, nearly 7,000 men The British surrender at Saratoga, paired with the twin victories of Trenton and Princeton from the previous winter campaign, convinced the French that this new country, these United States, did indeed have a chance of winning the war. Eager to get revenge after a century of losing to the British, the French declared a formal military alliance, with the United States declaring war on Great Britain and legitimizing the Declaration of Independence. In one fell swoop, Great Britain was about to become embroiled in a global conflict. Again, meanwhile, Washington spent the winter of 1777 to 78 training the Continental Army to fight the way European armies did. He was aided by the help from foreign officers, like the Marquis de Lafayette of France and the Baron von Steuben from Prussia. Steuben in particular instilled a sense of pride in the soldiers and trained them well in 1778. When word came of the formal alliance with France, the British abandoned Philadelphia and rushed back toward New York. Their new commander, Sir Henry Clinton, did not have a high opinion of the Continental Army, but did have a healthy respect for the French, and feared their presence would trap the English. In Philadelphia, Washington pounced as the British withdrew through New Jersey as a newly trained fighting force struck Clinton at Monmouth, New Jersey on June 28, 1778, and fought the British to a standstill. While the Battle of Monmouth was a stalemate, Washington's forces had fought well and withstood the British in an open field engagement. The British withdrew back to New York and would not venture into New Jersey in a meaningful way again. In 1779, the British began to feel the pressure of a global conflict. Realizing that the war could not be won in the North, the British turned their attention to the South, hoping to find more loyalist support. British forces captured Savannah and Charleston in the fall of 1779 and soundly defeated General Horatio Gates. At the Battle of Camden in South Carolina, Gates was removed from command, and one of Washington's trusted lieutenants, General Nathaniel Greene, was placed in command of the Southern Department. Greene knew that the local population was not nearly as loyalist as the British expected, and relied on the local militias and partisans to harass and harry the British supply lines. In 1780 and 1781, Greene and his other field officers lured the British away from the coast and into the Carolina backcountry, where they were soundly defeated at the Battle of Kings Mountain and Cowpens, as the British were lured further away from the Carolinas and into Virginia. The Carolinas exploded into a civil war as patriots fought loyalists for control of the states. Greene moved back into the Carolinas to recapture the states, fighting the British in a series of engagements and forcing them back to the coastal cities, where they started in the summer of 1781. Greene's army was exhausted from the near constant fighting, as was the British Army, under the command of Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis knew he could not stay in the South any longer. and marched his army north toward Yorktown, Virginia. In the north, the combined American and French forces marched south to intercept Cornwallis at Yorktown. Cornwallis found himself surrounded, with his back to the sea and no hope for rescue. After a month-long siege, he was forced to surrender. The surrender at Yorktown was the last major military action of the American Revolution. Peace talks opened after the surrender and took nearly 2 full years to finalize. In the end, the Treaty of Paris officially recognized the United States as a sovereign nation and was made independent and free from Great Britain. As the American Revolution raged on, the Continental Congress, having declared independence, found themselves not only with the necessity to conduct a war as a sovereign body, but to unite the now independent states in a loose Confederation government on November 15, 1777. The Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation, creating a weak central government which bound the states together only in times of great conflict, such as the ongoing revolution. The Articles worked through the war, as they granted the Congress the power to conduct the war as a united body and deal with foreign nations as such. After the war, however, it became apparent that the loose system of central government was not going to work under the Articles. The state governments had direct control over their own commerce, economy, and laws, and while many of these overlapped, not all did, creating chaos and confusion. The central government could not mediate the issues between states and disputes over state boundaries, taxation, and international trade began to push the government to its limit. The United States was less than a decade old and was already facing an economic and political disaster. One of the major indicators that change needed to be made occurred in fall 1786, when the economic situation began, leading to mass foreclosures and bankruptcies. In Massachusetts, Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays led a rebellion of some 12 other veterans who had not been paid for their service, nor had received a pension, and occupied the Massachusetts Supreme Court in Springfield, thereby denying the Massachusetts government the ability to foreclose on any property. They attacked the new federal arsenal at Springfield, but were unsuccessful in taking possession of the grounds. Fighting began to occur all over the state as the rebellion spread. Fortunately, the Massachusetts militia defeated the rebels, scattering them and putting an end to the fighting. It was clear the Articles of Confederation limited the federal government's ability to handle domestic issues as well as foreign policy issues. The Treaty of Paris, which had ended the revolution, made stipulations that debts owed by Americans to British subjects would still need to be honored, and that loyalists would still be able to bring suits to United States courts for the return of their confiscated property, as each state was liable for ensuring these terms were met. There were discrepancies across the country, as some enforced these terms better than others. The result was British troops still occupying forts and territory, which now technically belonged to the United States, as the terms of the treaty had not been met. With no authority to mediate or command the states to adhere to the treaty, the federal government could do nothing. With few options, a convention was called by several states in order to make amendments to the Articles. In May 1787, the Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia and began debating the Articles of Confederation and what would be required to alter them. It was immediately clear that the Articles did not work. But what form of government would? A fundamentally new design was proposed and hotly debated, as would become the hallmark of American politics. Several compromises were met to achieve the balance. The states required to ratify this new form of government. This new constitution would form a government of checks and balances, with three distinct branches, dividing the federal authority between them. The legislative branch, or the Congress, would be divided into two houses. The House of Representatives, composed of state representatives comparable to the population of each state, and the Senate, composed of two representatives from each state. This branch has the power to create and vote on laws, enact taxes, declare war, override presidential vetoes, create federal courts, except for the Supreme Court, and sets the number of justices on the Supreme Court. Independently, the Senate has the power to confirm presidential appointments to the judiciary, heads of departments, and other federal offices, ratify treaties with foreign powers, remove impeached officials from office. The House of Representatives has the power to impeach federal officials, including the president. The executive branch would be led by a president, elected by an electoral college, who would be vested with the power to execute, enforce or veto federal laws, appoint federal officers, grant pardons, and act as the primary role in all matters relating to foreign policy. As the commander-in-chief, it was also the role of the president to lead the military forces of the United States at the direction of Congress. The third branch, the judicial branch, would consist of a Supreme Court appointed by the President and approved by the Congress. The Supreme Court is responsible for the interpretation of the laws passed by Congress and acts as the final ruling on matters of legality. In a later Supreme Court case, Marbury v. Madison 1803, the Supreme Court added the determination of which laws of Congress are unconstitutional. While this check was not in the original Constitution, it is an essential part of the function of the court. A government by the people. For the people, it was the first time any nation's constitution had included the people as an instrumental in the establishment and validity of the government. The Constitution was drafted in September 1787 and distributed to the Congress of the Confederation. Instead of the amendments to the Articles they had expected, the Constitution offered an entirely new form of government. Immediate debate began. As the Constitution needed to be ratified, not unanimously by each state, as under the Articles of Confederation, but rather by a 2/3 majority. In October 1787, the first of 85 pamphlets championing the Constitution were published and widely distributed, known as the Federalist Papers. They were published anonymously at the time, although we know now that its authors were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Quickly, two factions began to form. On one side were the Federalists, who supported the Constitution and a powerful central government. On the other were the Anti-Federalists, who saw the Constitution as too powerful and detracted from the power of state governments. One by one, however, the states ratified the Constitution. The need for a change in government had become too dire, and most states realized that this Constitution would be the best way forward. The Constitution was officially ratified by the states over the course of 1787 to 88. And on June 21, 1788, the ninth state, New Hampshire, voted in favor, making the Constitution the new law of the land. George Washington, hero of the American Revolution, was elected in early 1789 to be the first President of the United States. John Adams, having received the second most votes, was elected his Vice President, while Washington did not ally himself with either the Federalist or Anti-Federalist factions, which had taken root. He did favor Federalist policies. In order to strengthen the fledgling government, he wisely filled his cabinet with the brightest political minds of the age, from both Federalist and Anti-Federalist factions, including Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph. During his presidency, Washington attempted to focus on the myriad domestic issues facing the country. He pushed the Congress to pass tariffs on imported goods in an effort to raise revenue for the federal government, and worked closely with his Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, to pass a series of economic programs and laws which would create a national bank and establish a national debt for the government. He selected the permanent location for the future capital of the United States, and would bear the name Washington District of Columbia, in honor of the first president. In times of crisis, Washington took his role as commander-in-chief, literally in 1790, in response to the Distilled Spirits Duties Act, or Whiskey Act, which taxed domestically distilled spirits. Farmers in western Pennsylvania began an armed insurrection. They attacked tax collectors and clashed with federal forces, prompting Washington to summon the Pennsylvania and Virginia militias to active duty. He personally led the troops into western Pennsylvania, and with a little show of force, His commissioners were able to broker the end of what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. In foreign affairs, Washington suffered from attacks on all sides. In France, their one-time ally, King Louis XVI, had lost control of his government and his people, resulting in an increasingly violent revolution. Trouble with Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean threatened to disrupt a fragile American maritime trade. England had begun the practice of impressment, or the stealing of sailors and ships from other nations, forcing Washington to demand satisfaction. Sending his friend and political confidant, John Jay, to England, Washington hoped to achieve an amicable trade agreement and cessation of American impressment. Jay returned with the treaty in hand and represented the American government well in Washington's eyes, bringing Great Britain and the United States closer together. Conversely, the Jay Treaty angered pro-French factions in his administration and around the country. Washington was elected for a second term in 1792, again with Adams as his vice president. He continued to struggle with the new French Republic, as in 1793 they executed King Louis XVI and were engulfed in a series of revolutionary wars. Washington leaned hard into his desire for American isolation from Europe, much to the frustration of the pro-French members of his cabinet, like Thomas Jefferson in 1793. During his second term, Washington was forced to remove himself and the government from their temporary capital in Philadelphia due to an outbreak of yellow fever. The government moved to Trenton, New Jersey, where the Continental Congress had once briefly met. In 1784, Washington struggled with the growing rift within his administration. The Anti-Federalists, now the Democratic Republicans, had grown further and further apart ideologically from the Federalists. Washington feared the creation of two political parties and warned repeatedly that their existence could lead to a serious fracture within the government. The Washington administration set many precedents for the United States government and the office of the president, from pushing domestic policies to foreign intervention, or lack thereof. Washington set the tone for his successors. His final act as president was to step down. While Congress had not yet placed any term restrictions on the office of the president, it was widely expected that Washington might just remain president or establish a kind of dynasty, not unlike a king. Instead, after 2 terms served, Washington stepped down and did not run for office for a 3rd term. His successor, elected by a narrow margin in 1797, was John Adams, whose foreign affairs struggles were equal or worse to Washington's. The situation in France devolved further into a period known as the Reign of Terror. Adams continued Washington's policy of isolation and further pushed the United States away from France. In response, the new revolutionary government of France began an unofficial war against the United States, or quasi-war. The fighting was kept primarily at sea. and involved in a number of naval battles with America's fledgling Navy. At home, Adams became increasingly unpopular with the Democratic Republicans as he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, allowing the government to arrest or silence any critics of the Adams administration's actions. In regards to France, a devil by members of his own party and members of the opposition, Adams took it upon himself to broker an agreement with France and end his administration in peace. In his final year in office, Adams and his wife Abigail were the first presidential family to move into the White House in the new Capitol in Washington, D.C. They lived and worked out of the building as it was put together around them. Adams ran again, hoping that his peace with France would regain favor, but lost out to Thomas Jefferson. Early in the electoral process,